Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Her Hollywood Unscripted, where I share stories of women who have forged through Hollywood and broken the metaphorical glass ceiling. Their stories are here to inspire other young women about the do's and don'ts of femininity's intersection with Hollywood. And I'm very excited for this episode because I get the chance to speak with my lovely guest, Dionne, who's a very talented producer. During her career, she was a female powerhouse in Hollywood who helped bring some very iconic projects to life, including School of Rock, Less Than Perfect, My Wife and Kids, and many others. So her stories and experiences are so valuable to my podcast, and I'm so grateful to be speaking with her. So, Dionne, thank you so much for carving out the time to be here.
My pleasure. So happy to be here. Thank you so much. I'm all smiles. This is wonderful.
So I'd love to discuss your background first and how you got into entertainment because I think you have a really unique background with your aunt being Marlo Thomas. So do you mind sharing your connections to the industry and how you got into it?
I definitely grew up in a Hollywood family. My grandfather was Danny Thomas, the comedian and entertainer, and started doing comedy years ago, like in the 50s, and ended up having one of the most successful sitcoms on television called Make Room for Daddy. It was just, I came from a Hollywood family. And so all I had ever known growing up really was television and visiting the sound stages that my uncle was producing shows on. And so I started to feel really comfortable on those sound stages. And I think my connection came when it was time for me to sort of like start looking for work. I decided to go to work at a big talent agency and I interviewed there. They represented my aunt and uncle. But the difference was that's not the reason I got the job. Every single kid who was interviewing for the job, and I was like I think I was like 17 or 18, because I worked there every summer in college. Everybody interviewing was somebody's like kid. Everybody was related to somebody important, much more important than the people I came from. So I was actually surprised that I got the job, but I had a really great interview with the loveliest man at the talent agency who was doing the hiring. And he hired me, and I was still a teenager, and I worked there every summer during college in the summer training programs at the agency. And then when I graduated college, UCLA, I went straight into their agent training program, and I had interviewed for that, and I got it. There were only about, I don't know, maybe 16, college graduates in that program, and I was one of only two girls. So it was pretty intense.
That's really interesting, your point about everyone having connections to someone. Do you think that's common in the industry?
I do. I mean, I think, it's nepotism. It can be, and it can be helpful and it can be hurtful. And I have examples of both. I mean, I think it was helpful in that situation because it got me in the door, but it didn't guarantee anything. I was just one of the gazillions of people who were interviewing. It was a popular job at that time, and it's still popular. I now have friends' kids who are interviewing for that exact same job and working there. It's cutthroat to get those jobs.
And do you think women and men are steered in different directions when getting into the industry?
I just think, back in the day when I was doing it, there were definitely traditionally more male agents than female agents for sure. I mean, there were very few female agents at that company at that time when I was young. I mean, maybe there were five.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, there were just not a lot. And now there's a ton more female agents. I mean, I think it's definitely gotten better for women. I don't think the salary thing has necessarily gotten better. And that was a big issue for me later in my career when I left agenting in that business and I moved to production. So I do think that there's a definite discrepancy in salaries, but I think there's a lot more female producers probably than there ever were. And I mean, I think in my business that I transitioned to production, I knew as many male as female producers in my position, which was line producer. So I don't think it was as discriminatory by the time, it was in the 2000s, at least for me in my experience.
Yeah, and can you describe what you did as a producer for those who don't know?
As a line producer, I'm basically the only non-writing producer on a project, and I work in television comedy, multi-camera sitcom. And I did start at my uncle's company. So I looked at it like the 4 years that I spent at that company were almost like my grad school. So I graduated UCLA, went straight to the agency that I worked for. And then when I decided I wanted to leave that, which was about a year after starting there, I went straight to 4 years at this television production company. And I feel like I had a lot of mentors, which I know is another one of your questions, but I really had a huge female mentor who was running, um, business affairs and production for that company combined. And she just took me under her wing and basically taught me everything. And so in my job, I learned how to do a budget for a television series and then keep within that budget, which it included everything from production design to wardrobe to post-production to music and all of the staffing. And I was budgeting for every single department in the show, and then I oversaw every department head on the show. So I was their supervisor, and I hired everybody too. I made every single person's deal on the show, and then I was the liaison between the studio and the network for the exec producers. So my only bosses were the people who created the show. And I worked for them handling all of those things that I just named so that they didn't have to, so that they could focus on writing the show and, doing post production for the show and them doing the editing and sort of like the final product. But as far as like the scheduling of all the actors and, everything that has to do with making all the pieces fit in production, that's my job and doing the whole production schedule.
That's awesome. I think that's really cool for people to hear, just the breakdown of everything that you did. And then you said you started at a talent agency.
Uh-huh.
And
Yes.
what like your first job, what did your day-to-day look like? What were some of the roles that you were in charge of?
So I was in the mailroom, and at the time it was like 88, 89, 90, 91. I mean, we had no, email. We had no computers. We copied scripts. And we drove them all over the city to different actors and producers and directors and writers. Everything was done by hand. So when mail would come in to the agency, we would, all the agents had boxes. So you would like distribute their mail into each of their boxes. And then oftentimes you would be delivering their mail all over the agency. It was a big agency. So, that took time. I would get up at like 5 a.m. and I would have to be at the market by 6 a.m., picking fruit, picking up bagels, basically picking up breakfast for all the breakfast meetings in the different meeting rooms all over the agency. That was the first thing I did every morning. But I just remember every morning I got up, it was dark outside. And I would have to be at the market and I would be in there with the grocers picking all the fruit that didn't have marks on them because you had to have perfect fruit delivered to these meetings.
Oh my God.
And yes, the fruit had to be perfect. And anybody who worked in the mailroom in the late 80s understands this. Um, and then, you distributed mail all day. You drove packages and important things to people. You were called a runner. You floated and you sometimes worked on the desks of certain agents and you would answer their phones if their assistant was out and do their schedules with them and take their phone calls and run calls for them, let them know what their meetings were, and you were like their assistant for the day. So I did a lot of floating. And then what else did I do? I was a runner in the car too. So we had to drive everything everywhere. So scripts were driven to like Malibu and Santa Monica and, Culver City. And so we had to learn the routes. And we had 5 different city routes, and each, 5 different people in the mailroom were assigned to each route. And then you kind of graduated after you finished every route, and it was called being off the runs. And if you were off the runs, you had like basically gone through the mailroom. And so by the time I was off the runs and I had been in the mailroom for about a year, I decided I wanted to leave.
I'd assume that not everyone makes it out of the mailroom. That sounds like tough work.
Yeah, I mean, it was tough stuff. Some people couldn't hack it.
Yeah.
It
And
was hard.
in your climb to becoming a line producer, do you feel like being a woman ever held you back?
I think at that time in the mailroom, it was really hard to be a woman. I definitely experienced sexual harassment in a very extreme way. there. And that can be really disheartening and make you really want to take a step back and figure out if this is the right place for you. And that happened to me, and I did have to face that question. I think it can be really hard to be a woman. I think you have to prove yourself twice as hard. And I think, when I came to my uncle's production company, I waited 6 months till a job was open there. And when I came, everybody else that had my position on the different shows made $50 more a week than me.
Oh my God.
So, I mean, people were making $450 a week in my job, which was like an assistant production coordinator, and I made 400. So I had to make less money. I had to prove myself so much harder than everybody else. Um,
How did
I
they get
worked.
away with that? And like, how are there not lawsuits? Like,
Well, I mean, I wasn't going to create a problem because I felt lucky to even be given the opportunity. It just so happened there was somebody left. So there was like a space open, and I'd already had all this experience at the agency. So I came in a pretty lateral position. I wasn't getting any favors, but I did know that the other people were getting more than me, and I was mad. But, I tried, I pushed and pushed, and it wasn't until I left there that I started making real money. I didn't make a lot of money there. I didn't make what was fair for my job there, and I knew it. And I also didn't get the correct title there for what I was doing. So I was called an associate producer, but I was doing the job of a line producer, which it's a vast difference in salary. And I knew it. So I couldn't get that title until I left that company.
wow.
The
That's
real title and the real money for the real job I was doing. And that is horrific. And there was another man who sort of paralleled me in my career, all through my career. And he was there, and I never knew what he made or what he got, but I imagine they paid him like very handsomely. But later on in my career, when he and I were both at a very big network together, I knew he was getting like $12,000 more an episode than me. And he had more time in the business than me, but we were doing the exact same job. So it just was so unfair. And that happened for a long time because he was a man.
I feel like though your experience probably isn't uncommon because I'm sure a lot of women in the industry try not to make a fuss, try not to complain because they're
Right.
just trying to make it. And so you
Right.
kind of have to stick these things out. But then if you're looking back, that's so not fair.
Right. But you don't complain. You complain as far as you can until it'll be, I don't want to say dangerous to do so, but it's like not in your best interest to complain, but you find another way. Like ultimately, I do feel like I got paid fairly down the road. I just had to bounce around and go to other places to get higher rates and then come back and say, this is my rate and this is what I deserve to be paid.
Right.
Um, it just took, yes, it was harder. I mean, it was absolutely harder. I don't think now for me it would be a fight, just because you have an established rate and that's that. But it was definitely challenging, but I also loved the work so much. I really loved what I was doing, and I thought I had learned from the best company, even though I didn't get the title and the money that I know I deserved there. I gotten something that was so much more valuable to me, which was the knowledge. Like the knowledge was so valuable that I didn't care at that point. It was 1 year of like sort of being paid not what I deserved, but it's 1 year and I learned more than I could have ever imagined. And I took that with me to every single studio and every single network, and really was invaluable. So I'm okay with it.
Right. Which it sounds like you had an awesome perspective about that. What advice would you give to young girls who find themselves in the same position?
I would say don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to ask for what you want. And if somebody that's comparable to you is getting a lot more money, especially if it's a man, I think we're all as women in a better position today to be able to ask for, equal pay. And I mean, and to point it out, at the time I didn't feel that it was right for me to do that, but I would do that now in a heartbeat. I just didn't then.
Right. And I do want to talk about your husband being in the industry because I think that's a really unique experience that most women don't have. So
Mhm.
I do want to talk about that with you. What effect did your husband being in the industry have on you?
He was on my team a lot. So I would hire him as my post production person whenever he was available. So we ended up working together for probably about 12 years when he was an associate producer handling post production. And I thought that those were some of the greatest years I ever had in the business. I loved working with my husband because he's so excellent at his job. Um, the catch was I was his boss, so I was his supervisor, which is a funny thing in a marriage.
Totally.
And like we would come home from work and I would want to talk about work endlessly because I was in charge of the whole show and he didn't want to talk about work at all. He was like, let's leave that at work. But I was so crazy passionate about my shows and my job and what I was doing that I always wanted to talk about it. He didn't. So I think that was one of the things where it wasn't great for him. And I also think, to his credit, it's very hard when your wife is your boss. So what I did was I really allowed him a lot of autonomy in his job because truthfully, he's so good at it. I don't do post production. I don't love it. I don't even really like it that much. So it was a joy for me to have somebody handling post and that is so good that I didn't have to worry about it so much, or at all. Like I just let him do his thing. And that was really, really great, honestly, for both of us. And then he transitioned to directing, which was sort of a dream of his. And then we were like on the same level, and that was fantastic. And he's an excellent director because he spent 25 years in post production. So he really learned how to do it, and he's excellent at it. So I'm super proud of him. And now, we're on the same level, and he's working all the time, and he works in Canada and he works all over the place. So he's doing great. And I think the effect of us working together was a big positive for both of us.
That's
Yeah.
really cool too that you guys were able to help each other, and you were able to help him get work. I mean, that's awesome. And
Yeah,
now directing, so it sounds like it all worked out. That's really cool.
it did.
Do
It
you
did.
think there were ever instances in which, since you worked so closely, you were protected from gender discrimination or inappropriate situations?
I do. Because the only one I had after I left the agency, um, my husband, I think him being there was really great for me. It was more of a gender thing rather than a sexual harassment thing. But there was somebody there on that show who I didn't think treated people very well, and I think having my husband there was really helpful in that situation. But I'm so strong. I mean, that's one of the things that I am, as I speak up and I say what I feel. And if something doesn't seem right, I will say it out loud and I will always defend somebody who's being treated unfairly. So I didn't need him really there for protection, but I think I didn't get sexually harassed because he was there for sure. Nobody would dare do that with him around. If he hadn't been around in all those years, I don't know what would have happened, to be honest. Maybe it would have happened, maybe it wouldn't have, but it didn't, certainly didn't when he was on the set with me.
So sad because it's obviously evident in your success that you're strong and perseverant, but just the fact that even those places of work can be unsafe to women is sad.
I mean, yeah, I think it's a different day and age now. I think what was acceptable in the 80s is not acceptable now, and 95% of the people know that. And if they cross that line, they know that they're going to be hearing from human resources, period. So I think people are less apt to cross that line now in my business, in comedy in my area, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen all over on film sets and other things. I don't know. I can't speak to that. But even in all the years, I was a producer for 23 years. I did not have on my shows a lot of sexual harassment claims. Um, I mean, there were certainly claims where people were unhappy with like somebody treated them in a certain way, but it wasn't for me. I didn't have sexual harassment claims on my shows. My shows were generally really, really happy sets.
Do you think that's largely due to the Me Too movement? Do you think that can be traced?
Um, yes, I mean, I think it's much better now, and people are much more aware, and human resources is activated and ready to go all the time for anything like that. So I just think people understand that it's not acceptable now. And in the 70s and 80s, there was a much more casual attitude about things you could say. And how you could touch somebody or what you might insinuate, just because you think you're all friends on a set. But the truth is, people crossed lines back then. And I mean, I know people who did it, and now it's just not acceptable. So I think Me Too was a huge help. And I think it empowered people in a way that they didn't feel empowered before. Now a woman can walk on a set and feel some protections.
And I do want to talk about the maternal wall and this idea that because women are expected to have kids, they maybe don't get promoted at the same rate or they're labeled as having priorities in other places. When you had kids and were in the industry, how did that dynamic work for you?
At one studio that I was with for a very long time, they were amazing and accommodating to me. And if I needed to go home or, I was nursing, so I would like have milk delivered to my house by somebody from the studio, or I'd go home, or I'd bring the baby, or I'd do whatever I needed to do. They were incredibly accommodating to me. And there were few women, even in the executive ranks at the studio, who were, they would come into my office and like everybody was, nursing or like pumping milk or whatever we had to do to keep everything going at home, at work. I mean, there were a lot of women on that staff too. So it was really comforting. So that's when Ryan was born. When Jake was born, 3 years later, I had to go back to work. I had taken like a year off. And I remember being interviewed for a job, and this male producer said to me, "Didn't you just have a baby?" And I said, "Well, yeah, like 12 months ago." And he's like, "Well, you can't be coming back to work so soon." And I was like, "Excuse me?" And he was like, and this was like 2007. And he was like, "Well, I mean, what if something happened with your baby and you were in the middle of a shoot, like you were shooting a show?" And I said, "I would go and be with my baby, and the person who's right under me, the associate producer under me, would handle the rest of the show, of course."
My
And
jaw is on the floor. You cannot see it, but
I
that's
mean, it
crazy.
was horrific, and I didn't get the job. They hired someone who didn't have children.
I mean, I
So
think that's like my research through your personal experience. That's a perfect example of it.
I couldn't believe it. I was so shocked out of my mind, and just couldn't believe it happened to me. Um, but people have their own prejudices and their own concerns and their own worries. And this man, he obviously thought that I could not handle both, but I handled both for a very long time. I think it was 12 years that I worked I was a working mother. I had television shows on the air, and I had young kids at home for 12 years. And that's a really long time to do it, to juggle both. And I thought I did it really well until the day I decided I didn't want to do both anymore. So
What caused that decision?
well, I mean, unfortunately, I didn't like the hierarchy of the show that I was on at the time. Things had changed at an executive level, and I just wasn't enjoying it. Um, I, I, I mean, there's a lot more to say, but I don't really want to say it. I just realized that I would be happier at home. I got to do it all. I got to work as a working producer for several years before I had kids. Then I worked for several years with kids. And then now I'm just at home like a stay at home mom. So I got to do all three things that I think a woman should do.
And what were your female friendships like in the industry? And did you have female mentors that you watched juggle both? And how did that impact you?
Yes, my one female mentor at the first company I was talking about, she taught me everything. And I was with her when she had her twins, and she was making deals from her hospital bed. And I ended up doing something similar to that when Ryan was born, too. I was like on the phone with my studio executives right before I gave birth. But I wasn't making a deal. I was just like on the phone with them checking in, and they were making
No,
sure I was
that's
okay.
crazy.
But she was actually making deals, and she was my inspiration because I thought she is so smart. She didn't even go to college. She's so smart, and she's so with it, and she can do it all. She's having these kids. She's, the head of this production company. She's doing everything. And she was really a role model for me. And she's to this day one of my best friends. And when I was nominated for an Emmy. And at the Emmy ceremony, she came to sit next to me at my table after I didn't win. But it was such an honor to be nominated. And she came out of nowhere. She appeared and she sat down next to me. And that was one of the best moments ever for me because she was like life coming full circle. Like she had taught me everything I knew. And then here I was at the Emmys. And then there's one other woman who I met at the same company who I've known all my life. And she's who I went to work for she was the exec producer when my son Ryan was born. And I was telling you that there were all these females that were having babies and really understanding about what we needed to do to get the job done and as mothers. And she's another one. And she's also still one of my closest friends. And she was just here last week when I was like having surgery. So she's a big, big, big person in my life. And I love the female mentors I've had in my life. And those two are my biggest.
That's
Yeah.
awesome that you had those women
Yeah.
alongside of you for those things. And I think it's just a testament to women's solidarity and how powerful it can be.
Oh, yeah. They were everything to me, those two.
I do want to get you to react to a quote that I've been having other women on the podcast react to. And it's a Sydney Sweeney quote that I thought was really interesting. And it says, "This entire industry, all people say is women empowering other women. None of it's happening. All of it's fake and a front for all other stuff that they say behind everyone's back." To what extent do you feel like the industry presents as a place where women are empowering other women?
Well, I think Sydney might be reacting to it as an actress as opposed to somebody on the production team. I don't know if she's a producer, maybe she is, but she may be feeling some sort of competition between actresses who are all vying for the same jobs and the same positions.
Right.
I, and that's how I take that comment. I mean, I feel like the women that I work for, it's not super competitive in in my role and in the roles of the women above me who are creators. I think we all have our own defined positions. And I mean, I have once felt like somebody was crawling like up the back of my neck to get my job, but that person was so not qualified to ever have my job and didn't have the relationships, the connections, the decades, you know. I that was one time. The rest of all the other 23 years, I have felt nothing but support and always have tried to support the women below me. In fact, I think women are best suited for this job, I hate to say, but in the details, like the devil is in the details in the producing job. And I have just found that women are so good at that job. And um, I don't know. I mostly work with men though, which is an interesting thing. Like I've loved working with men in the job right below me, but I think the one of the women that I've worked with is so excellent too. So it's just really hard. I prefer working with men, but I also answer to a lot of women who I love. So it's like a really hard thing for me to say, but I always try to empower other women. And I think Sydney is wrong about production. I think if she's talking about other actresses, I understand what she's saying. They're all vying for the same jobs. It's got to be brutal.
Well, I think that's interesting, and I also think that's good to hear for young women who want to get into the industry because obviously that's kind of a defeating statement. But what you said is really reassuring to hear. And on that note, I am wondering if you have any general advice for other young women trying to break into entertainment.
I think it's to be strong and know who you are, never compromise who you are to be what somebody else wants you to be.
How did you come to, was that advice given to you or?
Interesting because you brought up Marlo Thomas at the beginning of this conversation. And, you know, my Aunt Marlo created a book in the early 70s. She created a record and a book called Free to Be You and Me, which was sort of the mantra of my childhood. And all of the young boys and girls who were my age, like in their mid 50s, knew what Free to Be You and Me was. And it was this collection of stories and songs empowering children to be whoever they are. It was really progressive at the time, obviously, but it was a lot about gender and inequalities that maybe kids could see and, you know, in other people or around themselves in the world. And it was more about like exploring who you are and what is your identity. And can you be this job, even though that's, can you be in this job, even if it's traditionally a man's job? Or can you do this job? Can you be a nurse if you're a man? And the answer was yes, you can be anything that you want to be. And that book was dedicated to me when I was 3 years old. So my whole life I was raised as this woman who was free to be whoever I needed or wanted to be. I didn't have to, be some ideal representation of what, my family or a man or a husband or anybody wanted me to be.
I think that's an amazing mantra, and I think that's so awesome that was instilled in you so young, because I think there's something to be said about women who are their authentic selves. They're just more magnetic and you want to be around them. So I think that's awesome advice, and on that note, I think that's a perfect note to wrap up on. So thank you, Dionne, so much for your perspectives, for your insight, for your stories. I really appreciate you being on my podcast.
Of course.